boyunca cevaplısı. Bazılar çok продолжение на вопросы.
Okay, so thanks a lot for your invitation and for the possibility to present you indirectly here the philosophy of exhibition landscape, the Swiss cultural landscape architecture. Thanks for recommend all these colleagues and friends who made this possible, both the exhibition and this talk. What we intended to do with the exhibition is to say something not only about the Swiss landscape architecture, but at the same time about landscape architecture. So this is not necessarily a sort of national and not at all a nationalistic exhibition. It's not about passports, and people will see that some of the protagonists will show in this exhibition are not even technically Swiss. The most famous Swiss landscape architect today, Günter Vogt, he's from Liechtenstein, so technically he's maybe not a Swiss. But it's about people who work in Switzerland and who do interesting things. So, and at the same time it's about landscape architecture. What is landscape architecture? So I start with this slide. I really like it because I think it's a way to ask ourselves, do we know where the disciplines of design go? Do we know what architects do today? Do we know what urbanists do? Do we know what landscapers do? Where do we go? How do we plan? Do we know to plan our world, or is it very badly planned? I mean, it's enough to think about many places you know. You walk around your town and many thousands of other towns, and so many things don't function. So probably there is a crisis of the disciplines of design, and we want to raise these questions. We don't want to simply to celebrate. So what is it what landscape architects do? If we deal with landscape architecture, we have to start with getting aware that it is a very young discipline. Architecture has existed for more than 2,000 years, even theory of architecture, but landscape architecture is a very recent adventure. It starts with this gentleman, Humphrey Repton in England, 1789. It's a year of the Great Revolution in France, so you can easily remember it. And this guy, Repton, he, with a very British, very pragmatic sense, the first thing which he did, he printed a business card. And each time when he saw some rich people, he said, don't you want a design? I will design you your garden or your wonderful place where you live. And he writes of himself, he's no more a gardener, but he's a landscape gardener. And he's a guy with an instrument, with the optical instrument. And his visiting card tells us something about the way he interprets landscape architecture. Here's Repton again. You see, he's someone who is very good in drawing. And he was an artist, by the way. And he started as an artist, and then he became the first real landscape architect. And at the same time, some years later, 1804, you had a French guy called Jean-Marie Morel, and he will design himself as architect paysagiste. So you see, landscape architecture starts around 1800, very recent compared to other disciplines. And this is one of the figures you know, even if you don't know him. This is Frederico Holmstead, possibly one of the most influential landscape architects of all time. You know him because we'll see in one moment one of his most celebrated work. And this is a Swiss landscape architect called Dieter Kienast, maybe the most famous one. One of the posters in our exhibition deals with him. So Dieter Kienast. And few people know him, even in the profession. Naturally, ultra-professionals, people who really study landscape architecture know him, but it's difficult. There is not, while architects are quite known today, the landscape architects are very often forgotten. This is one of the ideas to make this exhibition. Now, one of the main problems also for the exhibition on landscape architecture and of landscape architecture discipline is representation. And Repton, the first landscape architect, immediately understood it. And what is representation for Repton? How did he work? These are the famous red books. So Repton would go to his clients, he would spend a week or two with them, he would draw, he would make these beautiful watercolors, and 3 months later he would come back with the red books and he would say, this is the project, this is a design, and you have to pay me, and you have to pay me a lot. Because there are many gardeners, there are many workers out there, but I am someone who have the idea. So I have the project, because I have it elaborated in my mind. And so he went there with these beautiful books, and he developed even a method before and after. Before and after. He called it before status quo. So, and then you had these wonderful watercolors, and you raised this, you could move this piece of paper, and behind the existent, he showed us what it would become. So he made something which architects and landscapers still do. He made his client's dream. So he said, that's how it will become. Or in another project you see, again, he said, this entry of your domain is not good enough, so you have to transform it. So landscape architecture, as Repton understood it, is about how to change the world, how to change a site, and representation from the beginning was fundamental. Jean-Marie Morel, the Frenchman, he was a very good painter too. He was an engineer of the famous school of Poix-José, but he had a lot of skills. And you see, drawing, representation is still very, very important. I'll come back to this. And someone who understood this perfectly is Frederico Holmstead, the guy I showed you before. Holmstead, who started his career when he, together with an Englishman, Calvert Hall, he won a competition for Central Park in New York. And what is very, very interesting in Central Park, if you look to this plan, you see it's both a plan, a map, but it's a logo too. And this is still very important, very interesting. So you see, if you can invent a project which is at the same time a logo, this means that things are recognizable. And immediately everyone recognizes, well, this is Central Park. And you see how in this project, in this representation, all these layers come together. This is Dieter Kienast. You see the Swiss landscape architect. He worked at the end of the 20th century. He worked with collage, but with drawings too. So you see the form changes, but representation is important. And our exhibition is a form of representation as well. Now, what do landscape architects actually do? What is the result of what these people do? If you go to England and generally to the UK, you can still visit many of the places transformed by Repton. So these are places, and you can easily find a list and you can travel around. But for the case of Jean-Marie Morel, the Frenchman, he made 42 projects and only one survived. So you see, there is even a problem of heritage of landscape architecture. Do we have to protect these works, and which works will we have to protect? And there is only one work, and it has been even heavily modified. With Olmsted, we're in a more happy situation. Everyone knows Central Park, even if you haven't been at Central Park, because there are thousands of films and photographs, and everyone has been there. And Central Park is naturally still there. Even if it's modified every 30, 40, 50 years, there is some very important work done on Central Park. So is it the same Central Park? Was it changed? Many, many problems. But not all the projects are so happily, have such a happy present or future. This is Franklin Park in Boston, and partly a golf today and a golf course, and it's more difficult. So you see, even very important works done by landscape architects sometimes disappear. And this, so I told you, what do landscape architects do? This is Dieter Kienast, a famous project in Chur, in the eastern part of Switzerland, and in Graubünden, and it's a cemetery. By the way, the cemeteries are a very important theme of Swiss landscape architecture, but I would say of landscape architecture generally. There are many, it's interesting. And Kienast took this very seriously, and he created this incredibly complex work for a cemetery in Graubünden, in the eastern part of Switzerland. And this one, I showed you another work of Hans Kramer. You will find Ernst Kramer in our exhibition too. He is almost forgotten, only specialists know him. And this is a famous garden exhibition in Zurich called G59, Garten 59, G59. And he made this project. It was very controversial at the time. By the way, you see, Kramer too had, he knew that it's very important how you present things. And then this was the result. And this was the garden of the poet, der Garten des Poeten. And people were astonished. We can imagine this Swiss family who came there and maybe Madame said, what is this? Is this a garden? It's nonsense, etc. And maybe they were mad with Ernst Kramer, maybe not. But I show it to you because Ernst Kramer is forgotten. But one of the most famous figures in contemporary art today, Robert Smithson, the sometimes so-called land artist, even if Smithson never called himself a land artist. But Robert Smithson was directly influenced by Ernst Kramer. So you see an almost forgotten Swiss landscape architect who influenced one of the foremost artists of the 20th century. This is Spiral Hill. It still exists. So this is our first introduction, the first chapter, just in order to go towards our theme. I will come back to, so when we started to work on our exhibition, we asked ourselves, what does Swiss landscape architecture has in common? Are there certain qualities which people share? You know, Switzerland is a very strange country. It is one country, but at the same time 4 countries in one, 4 languages, very different traditions, very different religions, etc. So, and this, we will find this difference too in the protagonists. So we have very different protagonists, both old and young, both modernists and postmodernists, etc. But still we found 3 elements. I will speak about this at the end of my talk. The first one we called it form, or elegance. The second one we called it minimalism, or rigor. And the third one we spoke about ecology, but in a way I would like to explain to you. So this is really the beginning. Now, I don't know what happens here. I don't know why my copy is not complete, so I will have to copy again now. Fine. So sorry for the delay. So we start with the artificial mountain developed by Ernst Kramer, and then we saw the one by Robert Smithson. And artificial mountains are still a very important theme of landscape architecture today. Here you see one by Christophe Giraud, It has been built in the southern part of Switzerland, in Ticino. Sorry? Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. So you have it here. So this is Sigirino. It's an artificial mountain built for the new tunnel, the longest tunnel in the world, 63 kilometers. And Christophe Giraud, who has his studio in Zurich, he built an artificial mountain on a mountain. So you see the mountains are still a very important theme. So I will start to, my second reflection goes to the theme of the mountains. And I want to tell some words about the idea of nature. So very often when people think about Switzerland, they make an association between Switzerland and nature, and especially wild nature. And they think about especially the Alps as a place where, as a sort of perfect place. But nature and the Swiss Alps and the Alps in general were considered until the 17th century as a very dangerous place and as a place of the devil. And so you see here an illustration of the 17th century, but for a quite long time, until the 18th century, the mountains generally and wild nature are interpreted as a place of temptation, as a place of negativity. And why is this though? Well, the main idea comes from the Bible, because in the flood, you remember, once the first humanity, which are the descendants of Adam and Eve who already betrayed God, they behaved so badly that the first humanity will arrive to a point where God punishes this humanity, and this is a great flood, 40 days of rain. And the 40 days of rain will destroy almost completely the first humanity. And theologically, we are the descendants of the second humanity. So we are descendants of Noah's Ark. You remember that on the Ark you have the happy few who escaped the great flood, the catastrophe. And after, when humanity starts again, we will live in a world which is negative, because we have to prove to God that we will withstand all kinds of temptations. And so nature, wild nature, the mountains, is full of devils, it's full of wild animals, it's full of dangers, and generally speaking, wild nature is marked by negativity. So this idea of wild nature, pristine nature, today everyone loves nature and wild nature. Probably nature is the last religion. You know, everyone wants to hug trees and to eat bio-salad and to be nice with nature. But this was not so like this in the past, because until the 17th century, nature was always disregarded. Because if you wanted to believe and if you wanted to have the eternal life, then you have to forget nature and you have to pray. And the immaterial things were much more important than the material things. So deluge, the great flood, was a sort of memento mori. We had always to think about, well, once God created for us a wonderful garden, Eden, but we betrayed him twice, and so he punished us. And the mountains and the high mountains were especially interpreted as a place of negativity, of temptations, of all kinds of ghosts and devils, and etc. And until the 18th century, here you see an illustration of a book of the 18th century. It's by a Swiss doctor, physician, scientist, mathematician, very intelligent person. But even he wrote a book on the Swiss canton Lucerne, and he said, be careful if you go in the high mountains, you will encounter this kind of animals. So you see, one could be very intelligent and open-minded in the 18th century and still wanted to believe that these strange things exist. Here you see Schweitzer, the scientist. And here again, you see his famous Itinera. It's a very famous book he published in the 18th century. It's a description of the Swiss Alps. So, at one hand, he was someone who had a very keen sense of observation, but at the other hand, he wanted to believe that, well, nature is something strange. And if you go to if you make expeditions into wild nature, whether you go to the mountains, whether you travel to the sea, whether you go into the desert, you enter a terrain which is not yet controlled by man, not yet domesticated, so you enter in a place which is full of dangers. So the general idea of nature was marked by negativity. It's linked to very complicated things in theology, St. Augustine, etc. But so it took a long time to change the interpretation of nature, to become globally positive after centuries and centuries where it was considered globally negative. One of the main figures who transformed the idea of nature is Albrecht von Haller. He was a Swiss mathematician and botanist, very famous in his time, and his book of botanics is still studied today. And Haller in 1728 made a walk through the Swiss Alps, and after he published a poem called The Alpen, and it was translated in all the European countries, it became a bestseller. And Haller invented 2 or 3 things. He was not very sure whether the Alps or nature was beautiful. He said it's useful, because he recognized as a scientist that that there is full of water in the Swiss Alps, and he said, well, water is a hydrological cycle and we need it. He said, maybe it's not really beautiful, but he said in the Swiss Alps and in some very remote regions of Switzerland, you have some people who are pure, and they like to be free. They're not Catholic. So he said the Catholics, these are the Italians, French, and Spanish, or the decadent guys. He, as a Protestant from Bern, said, happily there are some pure guys, some pure people in the Swiss Alps who survive and they want to be free. So he invented the myth of the good, of the exotic mountaineer. We naturally know that people in the mountains are not better or worse, but he invented this very, very influential idea that in the mountains you have a sort of population which has to, why is it free? And why are they more liberal? Because he said in the mountains, and especially in Switzerland, you have nothing. If you know Switzerland, it's a place where there is nothing. There are only stones and water. So you don't have anything. But he said, because the Swiss had to cope for centuries with nothing and that they survive, they developed an ethics of respect and of liberty, etc. And these ideas became very powerful. Then I will tell you something more about other ideas which changed the interpretation of nature. And here you see these illustrations of Haller's poem, it's called The Alpen, the Alps. It was really a bestseller, everyone read it. And after a second person, a very important, most controversial intellectual of the 18th century, he too, a Swiss guy, was very, very important, far more important than Haller, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You all heard about him. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau published in 1761 a novel called La Nouvelle Héloïse. It's a love novel, an epistolary novel. And in his book, the hero says, the only landscapes which I love are the landscapes of high mountains. And Rousseau, it's interesting, the first tourists who came to Switzerland, the first tourists who tried to make travel around Lake Geneva, they came to Lake Geneva to look if the places described by Rousseau are really so beautiful like Rousseau described them. So you see, our interest in nature is always artificial. It goes through the mediation of writers, painters, and so on. So Rousseau was very influential, and then we have a third element which is very important. It's the so-called aesthetic of the sublime. I'm sure you heard about it, about the sublime. The sublime used to be a category linked to rhetorics in antiquity. There is a treaty by a Greek author called Longinus or Pseudo-Longinus. And then in the 17th century, the treaty of Longinus was translated and it became very popular. What is the sublime? The sublime is nature which is extraordinarily big. And here you see, in the painting of the 17th and 18th century, nature becomes huge, so nature becomes interesting, the same nature which didn't interest for a long time, and the people become smaller and smaller. So this has a religious subtext too, because you see, you have the tourists, so the people who went into the high mountains, and they studied the landscape, they studied the glaciers, they were drawing, and there is a sort of complete reinterpretation of the relations between nature and man. So here nature becomes something which is celebrated. And here again, the Swiss painter of the 18th century, Caspar Daut, you see, we still had glaciers. They almost disappeared now, these last years. But these were still important glaciers. And here you see the artist who is sitting and drawing with his dog next to him. And so nature becomes something which is very important. And the aesthetic of sublime is, well, it's linked to many, many important discourses in the 18th century. One of the things which was very discussed in the 18th century is the theory of the origin of mountains. Now this may seem for you a little weird and strange. Why did people want to know where do the mountains come from? But it was linked generally to the theory of the interpretation of the herbs. Why? As I told you before, until the 17th century, the official interpretation was the earth has been created 12,000 years ago with the Great Flood. So all the theologians, all the priests would say the earth has been created 12,000 years ago, and this was a sort of initial catastrophe. And then slowly in the 17th and 18th century, especially the scientists said no, 12,000 years is not enough. Buffon, very famous French scientist who is the head of the Sciences Naturelles, natural sciences, he wrote a book where he published, he said our Earth is 80,000 years old. And in his notes he put even 1 million years. And he was immediately attacked by the Sorbonne and by the priest who said, no, this is heresy, you can't tell this. And in the 17th and 18th century there were two interpretations. The one was, the Earth is a result of the Great Flood, of a catastrophe, 40 days of flood, but explosions, etc. And the other one was, no, the Earth is the result of design, and God is the first architect, and he's an extraordinary designer, because the more people studied nature, the more they discovered that nature has a plan. So there is something, nature is so complicated that it needs a sort of higher intelligence, and this higher intelligence we can call God. To this, the intellectuals of the 18th century added a second problem: where do the mountains come from? And basically there were two very controversial theories. The one was a volcanic theory. All mountains were at a certain moment volcanoes. And the other was the Neptunian theory. So in mountain regions were a long time ago seas, so they were oceans. Because the more people went into the mountains, they found fossils, and when they found fossils, they said, well, the mountains are now mountains, but 1 million years ago they were, if you had all kinds of fossil animals and other forms of life, then once they were seas. So why is this important? This is very important because it changed completely the interpretation of nature. So nature became trendy. Everyone came to the Alps, and already in the 18th century, the British organized sublime and picturesque tours. So in the 18th century, if people wanted to be taken seriously, they would come to the Swiss Alps, especially. The Swiss Alps were a sort of laboratory where everyone would come and try to see and to admire these new beauties which were called sublime. One had to add to this another very important element. People starting to come to Switzerland in the 18th century, they discovered places which became very, very quickly topoi. Topoi means it became everyone in the 18th and 19th century would have had immediately, every European intellectual would immediately have recognized this place. This is the famous Staubach in the Barren Oberland, and people came from Russia, from America. This is a famous American painter, Bierstadt. He would come from America to paint it. So you see how the Alps and nature, wild nature, which no one was interested in for centuries, in the 18th century becomes something extremely trendy. And through the publications, and through many, many publications, this has an incredible effect. So people learned how to interpret nature. By the way, this is quite important to, if you think about it, we could say that every period, every historical period has its own interpretation of nature. We always reinvent nature. Nature is not the same. So, until now I spoke to you about certain phenomena which took place in the minds of the people. So while for centuries they found that wild nature, and especially the wild nature you find in Switzerland, high mountains, were the place of the devil, places of negativity. On the contrary, from the 18th century on, these same mountains became a very important terrain for tourism, for all kinds of expeditions. Now, from the 18th century on, these new trends will have certain consequences. I just want to show you two, linked to Switzerland. This is something which in Switzerland we call chalet, in Italy baita, in England maybe cottage. So it's an architecture which until the 18th century everyone hated. This was a horrible architecture of horrible people. No one had any interest for this. It's the English at the end of the 18th century who the first were interested in this kind of vernacular architecture, and because the people in Bristol, Manchester, Liverpool, London started to buy cottages, and the same British who came to Switzerland found that these constructions are very sexy. That's why then in Europe, and not only in Europe but everywhere around, the chalet, and especially the Swiss chalet, became a space which was imitated. So the Swiss chalet became a real topos. It was painted on all kinds of objects. In the 19th century, you could already buy Swiss chalets. You had catalogs where you said, well, I would love to have a Swiss chalet in my garden. You could make a travel around the world in South America, even in Asia. You will find everywhere Swiss chalets. For example, here you see a Swiss chalet, but it's not in Switzerland, it's in a garden in Paris. Or here it's a Swiss chalet, it's not in Switzerland, it's in England, etc. So you see people who imitated, people who asked their architects to design them a Swiss chalet, in a certain way took a metonymy, a piece of Switzerland, because Switzerland was so interesting, became so interesting in the 18th and 19th century. And the imitation of Switzerland went even further. Here you see some alpine scenes which were described in famous books and guidebooks and tour books. And then the same sceneries were imitated. For example, here you would say, wow, these are tourists in a wonderful alpine place. But this again is a private garden in Paris. But the people and the landscape architects who built these places, they wanted that they look Swiss, that they look like the Swiss Alps. So you see how a certain idea of the Swiss Alps and nature became a starting point of many imitations. These are books of the 18th century and the 19th century who show us how to build artificially a piece of mini Switzerland, sort of miniature Switzerland, naturally influenced by painters and by other models. Then another strong impact in the 19th century. Until now we saw things which took place in the mind of the people, some minor transformation, the chalet, the Swiss chalet, or some imitation of some spots. But actually the Alps started to be transformed in the 19th century by tourism. You see how strong the impact of architecture was here in the 19th century. For example, the bourgeois travelers and tourists in the 19th century could now very easily and without any danger come and admire the beauty of the Swiss landscape. And then still in the 19th century, in the same 19th century, the train arrived, and if you look to these places, I show you all these things because I find it important to reflect about nature and what nature do we live in. And I think as a landscape architect you have always to ask yourself, what is nature and what is my relation to nature? And so you see here, it's a beautiful nature, so everyone loves this today. And if you would say to people, let's take away the train, 90% would say, no, it's beautiful, it should be there. But should it be there or not? You see, this is modified nature. We transform nature. We don't live in a pristine nature. We lost the primeval nature a long time ago. And naturally lost it in the 19th century through the regulation of rivers, through the construction of railways. Remember, John Ruskin was very furious. He said, oh, we're destroying the landscape. But many other people were happy. And then came hydroelectricity. So you see, this is higher like the Eiffel Tower. It's a dam in Switzerland, like Honixons, more than 300 meters high. So it's a sort of gigantic sculpture. But you see, there are tens of thousands of people who come here every summer and they want to see nature. And what they find nature is even more beautiful because they can walk on this sculpture. So what kind of nature is this? And what does it mean? And what is natural in the Alps? For example, if we look at the road system, infrastructure. So you see, we live in man-made nature, and many places are quite weird in the Alps. So you see, we're very far away from the primeval and pure Alps, which people are still dreaming of. And there are many, many holes and all kinds of things which happen in the Alps. And look inside, if you look into the Alps, where there are so many things, you could make an underground travel, thousands and thousands of kilometers of roads inside the Alps. But the Alps are like a gigantic cake, where inside you have all kinds of very mysterious stuff. So it's not nature, it's something man-made. And if you look at this, and you see that man-made nature means infrastructure, means roads, means communication. But we still want to believe that nature is something sacred. And you know Heidi? I'm sure you know Heidi. And Heidi is very interesting because Heidi's story, which we all know, or most of you, is Heidi is a young girl who grows up without her parents, a poor, and then she in Germany, and then she goes to Switzerland where he has the most wonderful grandfather and the most wonderful dog and the most wonderful milk. So everything is superlative, everything is splendid, fantastic. And Heidi is the story of the possibility to go back to pure nature. But Heidi is a lie. Heidi is a lie because Johanna Spiri wrote this novel, which became a world bestseller, exactly at the moment when hydroelectricity and the train completely transformed the Alps. So Heidi tells the story of a pure nature which doesn't exist anymore. So in a certain way, it's a lie. And many other things which we find in Switzerland. So if we speak about nature, tell us very, very similar stories. You know this mountain, no? Matterhorn, Cervino, Cervin. Well, it was the most hated mountain. Even in a moment, in a historic moment, when people were getting acquainted with the idea of mountains, via the sublime and the picturesque, people in the 19th century still found this mountain horrible. Why? Because it had no vegetation. He said, this mountain doesn't have even vegetation. It's ugly. And then the British came again, and the alpinists, and then John Ruskin came. Ruskin made this wonderful drawing. He made the first photograph, too, of the Matterhorn. And he wrote a book where he speaks about Matterhorn, mountain painters. And at the end of the 19th century, the Matterhorn became a sort of national mountain, which is ambiguous too, because in Switzerland we forget that half of the mountain is in Italy, so it's half an Italian, half a Swiss mountain. But it became a sort of super mountain of Switzerland. And someone who understood very well the potential of this mountain, so you see what is nature, what is the original, is the guy who built this one. This is naturally Walt Disney. You see, Walt Disney. He built, if you go in around the world, in the different Disneylands, you will find everywhere the artificial Matterhorns. That's how you build a Matterhorn. So when we go to Zermatt and we ski or we walk, we would love to have this idea of Swiss nature, Swiss perfect nature, the snow, you know, it's a sort of defloration, it's a perfect snow, and it's a dreamlike landscape. But it's too late. This doesn't exist, especially because around 1910, a specialist in branding had this incredible idea to link the Matterhorn with the Toblerone. So, even if you have never been at Zermatt, if you have never seen the Matterhorn, you have eaten Swiss landscape. Everyone eats Swiss landscape. You go to Sydney in Australia at the airport, people eat Swiss landscape. They don't even know how to write Switzerland, but they eat Swiss landscape. And so, it's nice, yeah, it's nice. It's maybe good chocolate, I don't know. We can argue about this. But people want to believe. And every summer we have flocks of Indian movie makers, filmmakers who come to Switzerland. I never understood it why exactly, because you know, in India you have some small mountains too. But they come to Switzerland and they make their films, you know, it's always the same film, you know, these films where they dance, etc. But it's always a film where they celebrate pure nature. So you see, this idea of pure nature is still very much around. So that's the main story I wanted to tell you. The main story is about, I think about nature, because I think it's important before even we try to identify the specificities of Swiss landscape architecture to show you the ground. So that's what I tried with this short story, to tell you that the place, the setting of the country is very important. Switzerland is a very, very small country in the heart of Europe, but it became very, very important in the history of ideas, in the history of aesthetics, for the reasons I showed you. Because from the 18th century on, it was a sort of laboratory, and especially for the new aesthetic categories like the sublime, the picturesque, and so on. So it's a sort of paradigmatic terrain, and if we think about landscape architecture today, and you can say the same about architecture, Swiss architecture, well, then all the people who work in Switzerland are somehow rooted in this tradition. So they come from there. And I think the best of them, and those we show in our exhibition, they very much show us that they are aware of this tradition and all the contradictions and the specificities of this tradition. So to come to the really conclusive part, I want to come back to three aspects of Swiss landscape architecture. Naturally, you can discover more of these things and the details in our exhibition. That's what I hope, in our 36 posters. So the first one is elegance, or form, or style. There is a Swiss history of the good form. There is a very specific history of Swiss design. This is a famous book by Max Bill, a designer who not only wrote, but he was very, very influential, from watches to all kinds of objects. And the good form means that in Switzerland there is a tradition to look for the best possible form. There is a tradition of respect of good material. That's what I cited before, Albrecht von Haller, who said, we're a very poor country. Basically we have only stones and water. But before we have nothing, we had always to respect nature. We have to always to respect this nothing, because we have to survive with almost nothing. And out of this necessity was born a form of respect, and which you still find in not only in Swiss landscape architecture, but in architecture too, and in design, that is to look for the best possible form, for the most elegant form, for simplicity. Good landscape architecture is always simple. It's about simplicity. Now, especially if you work as a landscape architect or as an architect, or if you teach, you know, simplicity is always the most difficult to find. We often say to our students, your project is not simple enough. But the most simple one is the most complicated to find. And for Max Bill, when he speaks about the good form, he said there is a tradition of handicraft, Swiss handicraft, which is extraordinary. It goes from the smallest items, from the smallest objects of design, to the biggest ones, like, for example, the bridges. There is a school of Swiss engineering, different bridges, etc. So the form is very important. Form means too that, and this is another important idea, I think, linked to landscape architecture. If we try to make an opposition between architecture and landscape architecture, we could say, in order to simplify, where architects fill up the world with objects, buildings. Actually, that's what we ask them for. They have to build hospitals, they have to build houses, they have to build all kinds of objects. But good landscape architecture is not so much about what you do, but about what you don't do. So, good landscape architecture is very often about what you take away. Again, simplification. So many of our places where we live, so many of our streets, of our squares, of our cities are too full of objects. It's suffocating. It's like these bourgeois interiors where our grandmothers had all these porcelain and all these shit together. And we enter, and it's like a place which is, you're dead. I don't want to say that everything has to become IKEA. But still, you know, some fresh air, some opening, some grass, some light, etc. So landscape architecture is very often about, it has something to do with therapy. So to heal places, to make them better, to create better living. The second element, which is important, we try to call it faute de mieux. It's difficult to find the right concept, rigor, or minimalism, or restraint. This is maybe something typical to the Swiss to not be too exuberant, to control yourself. And maybe it has to do something with the mountain tradition too. The people who come from mountains, they don't have the exuberance, maybe not the generosity, or not the immediate generosity of the people who live in the plain. So there is something, and maybe it's linked to religion too. Maybe it's linked to Protestantism or to Calvinism, and if you look to, this is a piece of engineering by Rino Tami, but it's a piece of architecture too, but at the same time it's a piece of landscape architecture too. It's a highway. You see, to design a highway and to take all this effort and to make a good design and the best possible design, but at the same time it's very minimalist, like Swiss architecture. You know, it's almost bare, very Calvinistic. Maybe it hurts almost, so it's so bare, it's so naked, nothing to add, so no ornaments, nothing which you don't really need. So I show you some examples of contemporary Swiss architecture, which are very, very much in the same vein, in the same style. So you see how landscape architecture and design share more or less the same qualities. And the very last slide, and you find them in our exhibition too, and the very last reflection is, well, Swiss landscape architects, throughout these last decades, surprised us with ecological solutions which were really pioneering solutions. Now, there is a lot of bullshit done today when we use terms like sustainable, ecological. So there's so many people who do green buildings and everything greenish, you know. I even once met a mayor in South America who painted a very long wall in concrete in green, and he said, look how I love nature. So, you know, green is something so superficial, and what is sustainable? Well, sustainability comes from economy, and it's very, very complicated to define what is sustainable in architecture, landscape architecture, etc. But some Swiss studios, some professionals, some protagonists of our exhibition, very, very early, back in the 80s, they started to do ecological projects. And what does it mean to do something ecological? Well, first of all, this means, and you have in our exhibition the example of Hirschel Park, the park of the Zurich University. First of all, when you do huge work, the classical solution is whatever remains on the terrain, you have to take it away. And they didn't do it. They said the stones which we don't need, the rocks, we will somehow integrate it into the project. So don't artificially always move one place, stones and incredible masses of material from one place to another. Second element, they said we don't need insecticides and pesticides. Back in the 80s, and everyone were against them. They said you're communists, you want to kill the Swiss chemical industry, you're anarchists, you're terrorists. And they said no, let nature do. We can live even without pesticides and insecticides. It's a different, we don't need a perfect law in a public park. And they did another revolutionary thing. They were the first who dealt with rainwater. And they said we have to take the rainwater and not to lose it in the ground. And people didn't even understand what they were speaking about. And today, in most of the countries where you have important works of landscape architecture, we do it naturally. So, because we know that rainwater is something important. So you see, for me, this is revolutionary, this is ecological. So ecology, landscape architecture is not about big gestures, it's about small gestures. And landscape architecture generally is about small gestures. It's about how we can improve our world with very, very small projects as well. And the last remark is that naturally landscape architecture is not only the result of landscape architects. As our exhibition is not an exhibition about passports, Swiss passports or other passports. Christophe Giraud, who is in Zurich, he is a French citizen, he was a director of Versailles for a long time, but he is a Swiss landscape architect today and he has been for the last 10 years. But it's not either the passport of a profession. Architects, engineers, artists can naturally do very good landscape architecture. But the landscape architects are still the main protagonists, and it's them we like to highlight with this exhibition. Thanks for your attention. So you want to ask?
Someone has some questions?
Yeah. Or if you don't agree, you don't have to agree. Yeah.
You said the key component to design landscape architecture is to do as little as possible, and to take away as little as possible. But what if the situation is that you have to create it? For example,
What is the situation?
What if the situation is that you have to create it? You have to create the landscape. So, for example, there's a new parking structure, and you have to, and above it is a whole green area. So how would you approach it?
Well, naturally, landscape architecture, what you do underground and the site, doesn't mean that you have necessarily to cut your arms and not do anything. But I think good landscape architecture is to reflect 3 or 4 times before you start your work. And especially, it's about something very important, which people got aware of only these last 20 years, that before even starting to do something on the ground, and before even starting to finish your project or your drawings and etc., you have to think about what you are planning on a very long timeline. And I think this is the difference with the tradition of architecture, where very often, and the tradition of design, where for thousands of years, to design meant to go from the ground idea to your result. The result is a building, the result could be a park, and then once you finish with it, you go on to the other project. What makes landscape architecture different is that you have to start to begin with the first day when this project lives, and so you have always to imagine your park, your example. How will it be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years, and maybe in 100 years? What will change hydrologically, what will change with the climate, so you have to take into consideration time. And this, the time and processes, etc. And so that's what I wanted to say, that before even thinking of transforming a spot, a site, you have to be very, very careful, and then to think about what is the impact of everything we do on the hydrology, on the site, on plants, etc., on ecology. And this is not the way it happened until 20 or 30 years ago, where even landscape architects, and even some very famous ones and probably very good ones, they had very auto-referential projects. So typically you have a landscape architect who designed a beautiful garden, and the garden was in his plan. And he wouldn't waste time thinking what will happen in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, and if it will cost or not. Because they didn't have this idea. And once you start to place your project into a timeline, well, you will see that your design process will completely change, and you will have a degree of complexity which you don't have normally when you plan. So it's not about doing nothing. On On the contrary, I think it's very important to integrate landscape architecture today, and especially in the places which are complicated, like infrastructures. We have to, that's why I showed you Green Otami, for example, a highway. We could say, why do we need to care about the design of a highway? It's a highway. I think we have to care about everything, because everything contributes to, for us, to better living. And I think that good landscape architecture, as good architecture, makes better living. And bad architecture and bad planning makes bad living, and we're all surrounded in the world by very bad planning. Okay, so if there is no other questions, so please make a tour in the exhibition. And I think that's the real walk I want to invite you.